Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us tonight as we talk about the impact of COVID-19 on young adults. We gather virtually in these unusual days that create stress for all of us, including our students and young alumni. Tonight, we're joined by two distinguished alumni, Dr. Frank Gollum, class of 2000, and Dr. Gabriel Velez, class of 2003. Thank you both for joining us tonight. Our journey today evolves in ways we never expected, with so much unknown. Let's take a moment to come together and believe in the power of prayer. There is strength and solidarity in prayer, and even though we cannot be together physically, we're supporting one another spiritually. So we join together at this time to pray together. So good and loving Lord, we pray for our world, especially for all those who are ill. We pray for those who care for the sick. We pray for our students in the Regis community. We pray for our families, our friends, alumni, and benefactors. We pray for our faculty and staff. We pray for our school leadership and board. We pray for one another. Lord, we ask that you bring us wisdom for the doctors who work during this difficult time, that you give understanding to scientists, that you endow caregivers with compassion and generosity. Bring healing to those who are ill and protect those who are most at risk. Give comfort to those who have lost a loved one. Welcome those who have died into your eternal home. Gracious and loving God, we ask that you lift up these prayers and the prayers that we hold in our hearts. Calm our fears and anxiety and be with us through this trying time. Help us to understand the changes in our lives and to accept the things that we cannot control, and to be patient and loving to one another. We ask all this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
So thank you once again for joining us, both parents of our current students and parents of our young alumni. I'd like to introduce now Dr. Ralph Nophy, our school psychologist, who I believe in his 30th year here at Regis, who will introduce our guest speakers tonight. Thank you for being with us and have a great night.
Thanks, Father Lehart. As he mentioned, my name is Ralph Nophy, and I'm the Chris Wallace for this evening's webinar. In the 30 years that I've been here at Regis as a psychologist, one of the things that has brought me the greatest satisfaction is to witness the persistent bond of caring that lives in the Regis community. Whether it's alumni, parents, grandparents, former colleagues, people are always ready to step up when the school needs them. And for this reason, I'm honored to be hosting this discussion of a very important topic with two former students. I'm also delighted that so many Regis parents of both current students and recent grads have joined us. We have over 300 guests signed up tonight. And the format for the program is going to be this. I'm going to ask our guests a series of questions, and then at about 6:40, we're going to open up the floor to questions from the audience, which you can send us at any time during the presentation. All you need to do is click on the Q&A button that's on the bottom of your screen, then type in your question, hit enter, and it will go right into the queue for our question period. I do want to start with a little bit more of an introduction for our two guest speakers. Dr. Francis Gollum graduated from Regis in 2000 and went on to earn his BA in psychology from Loyola University in Maryland before receiving a PhD in organizational psychology from Teachers College at Columbia University. He's currently an associate professor of applied psychology at Loyola in Maryland, where he also serves as chair of the Department of Psychology. He's taught courses in consultation theory and practice, in industrial organizational psychology, and in applied research methods at the doctoral, master's, and undergraduate levels. Our other presenter tonight is Dr. Gabriel Velez, who graduated from Regis in 2003. He has a BA in history and literature from Harvard and then obtained both a master's and doctoral degree in comparative human development from the University of Chicago. He's currently an assistant professor and developmental psychologist in the Department of Educational Policy and Leadership in the College of Education at Marquette University in Milwaukee. His research interests include identity development and adolescence, particularly in relationship to citizenship, human rights, and peace. So welcome, gentlemen. We're going to begin our time this evening by discussing some of the findings from the study that Gabe conducted in the spring at Marquette about the impact that COVID-19 has been having on the outlook and the lives of young people. So Gabe, can you tell us briefly about the study itself? What made you decide to research COVID in this manner, and what the scope of the investigation was and the methodology?
Sure, Ralph. And to start, thank you for having me, and thank you everyone who is here and is attending. And basically, I was sitting in my home here outside of Milwaukee in March, and when we went under quarantine and things were really starting to take off in the US with COVID-19, I was struggling personally to process like what was going on, what was this meaning, how is this going to impact my life? And as someone who works a lot with adolescents and young adults, both in my research and then in my teaching and work at Marquette, I was thinking, gosh, I've all this experience, I have this relative stability, I've able to put things in a different type of context, and what does this mean, and how are young people experiencing this? People who are in this particular time when they're already trying to figure out who they are, who they're going to be, and that's a really salient part of their lives. And so I created this online survey, and working through basically trying to be in touch with schools across the country, and I ended up having one in Canada as well. I was able to get, in the end, the perspectives and the participation of over 1,000 young people, just about 1,000 in the end. And they were quite geographically dispersed. And so, as I mentioned, I worked through schools, and the Jesuit Schools Network, which is a network particularly of Jesuit high schools, was really important in this. But one of the schools was Regis, and there were some others. But because it was also heavily from Jesuit high schools that participated, and then some other young adults that I was able to connect with, it was 75% male. The age range was from 14 to 20, but it was really a lot who were sort of in that older range of adolescence, and then either in their senior year or into their first year of college. And then being a really sort of wide array that I was able to get. And I was really excited to capture these kind of perspectives and voices, and hopefully do them a little bit of justice in some of the findings that I have on a report that I know we're going to send out after, and then through webinars and other means like this.
That's great. Let me start with a broad question first. How would you sum up the emotional reaction that adolescents have been having to COVID-19? I know that's a broad question and there's a broad range of reactions, but share with us what you've been finding.
Yeah, and it is a really broad range. And I want to share sort of two examples, because I think in some ways this captures a little bit of that. And so the first is from one young person when I basically asked them, how is this affecting your life? What they wrote was, of course it's affecting my life all the time. I miss my friends, I miss school, I miss the gym. I just want to go out, and I absolutely hate losing touch with all of that, especially because I was on a good path right before we had to go into quarantine. I was socializing well, I was living life, I was happy, and I was becoming more confident as I continued working out at the gym. Coronavirus took all that from me, and so many other kids like me. And so in that example, you hear this real deep sort of feeling of this has impacted everything about me, and who I am and what I was going through. And then another response, for instance, was keeping myself entertained. Right. And so that young person, it was really a sense of boredom. And that's what it kind of ranged from. There were some people who were really expressing a sense of sadness, a sense of lack of motivation, and then that kind of built for some into an anger and frustration. And again, this was during the time of the quarantine, so this was in April and June. So I think there was a lot of frustration with some of the intense limitations that we were all experiencing. But then for others, it was boredom, or even for some, it was nothing. It was saying, I feel like this is not affecting my life in ways that are super powerful.
Thank you. Let me ask Frank. I know that you've conducted your own survey of students at Loyola. Can you tell us how their reactions compare to the kinds of things that Gabe has been describing?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I think, as Gabe was talking, I just kept thinking that, we've saw similar reactions in a very different kind of a survey, right? So I conducted a survey in my role as department chair to figure out how can we bring students back to campus, because originally that was our plan. And particularly we were focused on our graduate students and what our graduate students thought about, the idea of being back in a classroom. And, one of the things I sort of want to piggyback on what Gabe said is I just think there's a wide variability in terms of how young people are reacting to the pandemic, and more than you would think. I think there's a certain sort of stereotype that all young people think they're impervious to this, that they're driving up infection rates, that they're out in bars, that they're not, social distancing with their friends. And that's not really what we saw. There was just a huge range among the students in the in-house survey that we did. And in particular, there was a certain subset of students that I think were terrified at the idea of being back in the classroom. There was one quote in particular: "Please don't make me go back into the classroom. I'm begging for my life, please." And so you had these really kind of powerful, angsty quotes about people's concern, students' concern for their health and well-being. And I've seen that in our undergrads as well, even our undergrads who have serious health concerns. And so I think there is just a wide variability in terms of students' reactions and young people's reactions to the pandemic. And I think that it is not necessarily all the stereotype you see on TV or in the news that young people are just fine and are carefree about this. That's not been my experience of having to deal with young people.
And it certainly wouldn't be surprising to find that the way an individual student reacts to what's been going on is very often predicated on what they've been experiencing beforehand. The kids that have been cruising through college, like the quote that Gabe gave us before, that student certainly is in a different spot than someone who's been, struggling academically.
Yeah, I think that's consistent with everything that we've heard. I mean, one thing I have said to folks, just in sort of my experience dealing with students, is I do think that in some ways COVID has put a spotlight on dynamics and trends and issues that were already there. And so it has exposed the fault lines, but it didn't necessarily create new fault lines. And so I think we're seeing that in terms of our experience with students, at least for me.
Good.
I would really just echo that. I think that's really important to keep in mind, both of the students and then for colleges in general. I think a lot of what is going on has been an intensification and sort of made much more rapid things that were already sort of in the process.
And getting back to your study for a minute, what were some of the challenges and the disruptions that the older adolescents were citing when they were talking to you about their COVID experiences?
Yeah, so I think, that's a great question. And that, something that came up a lot was academics, right? Was things related to schooling. And I think that makes sense because schooling, whether they are in high school or they're in college, is such a part of their lives, right? In terms of time, in terms of identity formation, in terms of planning for the future. But what I think is also important is that it wasn't just about sort of being in a classroom in person, getting content or struggling with grades. It was a much more sort of all-encompassing that their academics tied into other parts of their life. And so there was a larger sort of issue, I think, with the disruption in their social life. And that tied into the physical activity, not being able to get out and about, particularly from the Regis students who are in New York City, where being quarantined means that you're in maybe a small apartment or, you can't feel safe even out on the street. I think that was something that was particularly salient. And then another part, I think that is really not being talked about a lot, and what I'm seeing in the discourses that are out there is just a sense of lack of control. And lack of control, for one sense, in the present with what's going on, in the sense of their lives, how they're being limited, what's even going on sometimes with their schooling, with their physical activity, but also lack of control around the virus, and being able to feel safe and even to protect themselves or their family members who might be at risk from that, but also a lack of control of the future. I think a lot of our young Regians, for many reasons, have been thinking ahead to the future. I remember when I was in high school and in college, and you're planning, and you're thinking in high school for college, and then you're in college, and you're maybe thinking about your summer opportunities or your career, and all of that was destabilized. That rug was pulled out from under them, and so I think that is also something that sort of across the board, there's a feeling from the younger ones in high school through the ones in college that they're experiencing.
I imagine that we're probably way too close to immersion in the crisis to have a really strong sense of where this is going in the future and what the long-term impacts of COVID will be. I know that people make comparisons to the 9/11 attacks in terms of the disruption. Clearly, people talk about the 1918 pandemic or the Second World War. Do you get a sense from your conversations and from the data that there's any hope for optimism over the long term?
Yeah, I would say, I know this is something we were talking about before, but there's some really interesting research that's been done on generations that have lived through some of these sort of momentous and I think really challenging societal moments. And I'm thinking particularly of research around World War II and around the Great Depression, and that those experiences, particularly at a formative time, sort of, and we're talking generally as a generation, right? So not necessarily about individuals, but created a real resilience and an ability to cope and some really positive, healthy life outcomes because of what they were going through during this formative time. Now, I mean, obviously there are things tied into that because things like the resources you might have, the stability of your family life, even whether or not the virus actually takes the lives of people in your family. I mean, those are going to have differential impacts, but on the whole, I think there is a sense that we can maybe feel that some of what might come out of this could be a generation that has sort of a different appreciation and different framework of seeing the world and seeing some of what's going on in their lives.
Frank, I see you nodding your head. Do you want to?
I'm an organizational psychologist by training, and so I think the impact of COVID on colleges, universities as organizations, the impact of COVID on all of our work lives. I mean, I think that we've all just learned that things we thought we had to do in the office or in a brick and mortar building, we can now do virtually. And so I think we're learning to teach virtually. We're learning to learn virtually. So it is unclear to me what the long-term impact of this will be, but I suspect that it will have, similar to what Gabe was saying, some upside when all is said and done. I think some sort of opportunity for resilience, both individual resilience, but also organizational resilience.
And I'll throw this out to both of you gentlemen. Can you say a little bit about what you think parents can be doing, or what kind of structures your schools have been putting in place, or we can be putting in place at Regis to kind of help students deal with how do they compensate for some of the things that they've been missing out on? I'm thinking of milestones like graduation or prom and things like that, which the losses are real to kids. From our perspective, or at least from my perspective as an older guy, I tend to have a longer perspective of big life events, but certainly it's in the lives of younger people, this is their opportunity to start having these special events. What advice would you have for our parents about how they could help kids, cope with a new paradigm?
Yeah, I think that's, a great question and an important one. One, I think, is to acknowledge that this is difficult and that these things are sort of being changed or being missed. I mean, I think normalizing that this is a challenging time and that they might be going through particular sort of either mental health concerns or this sense of missing out on these milestones, that's real, and allowing them to have that feeling in that space. And then also what I'd say is encouraging them and participating, sort of having them engaged in this process, but reimagining these milestones and traditions. I think, if you think about it, if they're an 18-year-old kid who's a senior in high school, they've probably spent, over a decade of their life watching movies, hearing stories about senior year, prom is in all of these coming of age, teenage movies. And so it's something that they've been hoping and imagining and expecting in a certain way. And so it's going to be difficult, but that doesn't mean that we can't find other ways to celebrate, other traditions to create. But I think bringing their voice into that to see how they want to be doing that and how you can take sort of maybe the limitations that are still existing due to COVID-19 and that reality, but also their desires and their wants and their, having their voice in that recognition of the celebration or of the change, the growth, the milestones that they achieve.
Yeah.
And certainly that would be a mechanism. You were talking a little bit earlier when you were discussing research on young people growing up during times of great turmoil, the kind of silver linings of learning that these are opportunities to learn the skills that would help them come out of this experience with a greater sense of self-efficacy.
Mm-hmm. Certainly.
I would just add, I think we talk a lot about, and rightly so, about the experience of, high school seniors and all the sort of momentous occasions and milestones that they've missed out on. And we're seeing that at the college level as well. And there's a real general FOMO or fear of missing out. from all of our students, and I've been hearing from undergraduate students on a regular basis. And I think that they, you know, we're encouraging them to have virtual events with each other through Zoom, Google Hangout, things like that. But I think there are other things that, you know, we can all be doing. And so there's lots of platforms now, for example, that allow you to stream movies with each other live so that you can sort of be connected and watching the movie at the same time from different places. I know Netflix has some of those sort of platforms. There's another app that somebody just told me about last night, which I think is called Rave. That allows you to kind of watch a movie together electronically. I know that just in terms of other things that we've been encouraging our faculty to do or encourage our students to do is to, you know, there are platforms to do like online scavenger hunts, for example. So I did this in my undergrad industrial organizational psychology class last year, which was sort of wild, but had them running around the house, finding things, taking pictures, posting them online in a platform called Padlet, where you can just have different teams and they can all post photographs. And so these kinds of things, which may sound silly, I do think help, at least at the college level, replace not the milestones. You cannot replicate a graduation. You cannot replicate a prom. And in some ways, I believe that trying to do that can sometimes cause more harm than good. There are certain things that are not replicable via Zoom, but there are moments of interpersonal connection that you can really reinforce via Zoom. And so whether that's a virtual hangout, a movie watching, an online scavenger hunt, I think all of that is important. The other thing, if we want to sort of back out and think about advice for parents and what parents can do, one of the things that I think is really important is just this notion of having healthy boundaries. So, you know, Gabe and Ralph and some of the other planners on this event have heard me talk about this before, but, you know, everything right now is sort of bleeding together. And so, you know, boundaries when they're healthy are firm, but they're also permeable. So there's just lots of overlap now between people's and kids' academic life, their social life, their mental health. So really being able to help them navigate that and understand that all of this is kind of bleeding together. And at the same time, knowing when the boundaries need to be firm. There are some faculty here at Loyola who were telling a story and talking about how they were teaching their Zoom classes to see like parents sitting in the background of the Zoom session, sort of spying on the class and sitting in on the class. And we're all very, you know, talented faculty with interesting things to say. But there is a sense of, you know, holding that boundary and protecting that boundary for your child, for your son, for your daughter, so that they can learn and have the kind of experience they would have had if they went away, as much as I would love to see you snooping in the back of my class. And, you know, boundaries, I just want to say, I think sometimes it's like, oh, well, what's the big deal, right? Like they're just listening to something and I'm just listening in. But I think that boundaries really serve as a container for anxiety, right? When I do work with clients as a consultant, that's what I tell my clients. Like having clear boundaries helps people feel less stressed and less anxious. And so this is already an anxious time. And so when you don't have the clear boundaries and you don't respect the boundaries and help your son or daughter hold those boundaries, all that does is create more stress. That has a mental health implication, but it also has a work productivity implication. So I think my students are better when the boundaries are stronger, and I think they're able to learn better. And so that's something that I think is really incumbent on all parents to kind of help their kids hold those boundaries.
Yeah, Frank, I think that's a great point. And I would even just add to that, even thinking if parents want to do something and concretely, the physical space, right? And, you know, you're the organizational psychologist, but one of the things I was hearing from some of these participants is, you know, I'm using my bedroom that used to be my space to disconnect and to rest as my space to do my classwork now. And that's really hard. And obviously there are going to be limitations. Those are going to be different for all of us. But I think for universities and for families, to think about how can I help create these boundaries and these spaces for my students and my children to support this sort of healthy way of keeping those spaces separate as needed.
Thank you for those solid pieces of advice. I think people are going to find that very, very helpful. And I should mention at this point that we will be sending out an email tomorrow with additional resources that parents can access online for helping their kids cope with doing college from home or doing high school from home. I would like to turn the conversation away for a little bit away from the study that Gabe conducted and ask both of you some questions relating to your role as teachers and administrators at two colleges. And Loyola and Marquette are both following different models of instruction at this point. At Marquette, you have students back on campus with both in-person and remote learning going on. And at Loyola, there may be some graduate students on campus, but there aren't any undergrads right now, correct, Frank? That they're
That is
100%
correct.
remote. So could you guys comment a little bit on what that experience has been like?
Yeah, I can jump in and say, I think in the background of this, also it's important to keep in mind is complex sort of financial realities for these universities. And that's not to say that I think they're just thinking of the bottom line, but thinking both about how can we support our students and how can we keep things safe and healthy, but also what are the real life costs that we're facing in doing that. So an example at Marquette is a lot of income does come from students living on campus. And so they've opened up the dorms, but in order to try and keep them as safe as possible, they've de-densified them, right? So they've taken a dorm that fits 100 students and maybe now there's 50 to 80, something like that in them. That has a financial impact. Or setting up, mobile sort of screenings, different strategies. I know things are happening at universities. And so I think it's important to keep that in the back of the mind. And, as faculty, I know that's part of the conversations that are going on and some of what's happening. Now that's sort of at this larger level. I think for number one, though, what I've really experienced, and from the beginning in March, a key topic was about the quality of instruction and converting that to remote. I think there's a real recognition that a lot of faculty are not used to this, are not used to teaching remotely, or not used to having to support students remotely. And so there's been a lot of time and energy and effort. In the spring, I would say it was a little bit sort of reactionary in the sense of, really trying to be responsive. And then through the summer, it became planning ahead and really training and developing these skills, because that is something that there was a recognition that we were building towards. Marquette at least was thinking ahead to more sort of online and remote teaching, but it wasn't something that across the board faculty were comfortable with or could necessarily manage. And the software wasn't even necessarily something they were versed in. So that's been sort of a number one thing, I would say.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that quality of instruction has really been, it's particularly for me, both as a teacher and also as department chair, quality of instruction is basically how we have spent the last 6 months. I mean, really trying to think about how can we deliver what we normally deliver, and particularly, here at Loyola, this is a Jesuit campus. It's a high-touch campus. It's cura personalis in the same way that Regis was. And so, how do you do that virtually? And one thing that we learned pretty quickly in the spring from our undergraduates was that they preferred their online experience to mimic their real world, or what would have been their real world experience, as much as possible. And so the literature in online teaching and online learning talks about having asynchronous classes as a best in class or a best practice, right? So that the material just goes up and students learn on their own pace, and there's no live synchronous real-time component. So originally when Loyola shifted, everybody kept saying, well, the literature in online learning and online teaching says we should be asynchronous. And what we quickly found is that that's not the experience our undergraduates wanted, right? They wanted to meet regularly with their professors and each other via Zoom in a synchronous session. And so if my class was supposed to be Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 10 to 10:50, and not Hall, which is the building that my office is in, what the students wanted was to be on Zoom with me Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 10 to 10:50. And, that made it really clear to me that there's a difference between online teaching and teaching online. And so there is a whole literature about online learning, and it is good and it is robust for when you are designing deliberate classes that are online classes in a sort of smorgasbord, if you will, of other classes, most of which are face-to-face. Then asynchronous is better, and it's good and it's fine, and people can learn at their own pace. But when you're in this kind of emergency COVID situation, online teaching is different, right? Like what we're doing now is teaching online. And so I think the struggle has been to kind of replicate all of the experience that we would be having in the classroom and in person, and to do it one-on-one in real time, but just via Zoom. I think that's been a big struggle for us and a big learning for us, and something that we've done here, at least in the psychology department, is really focus in on how do we do synchronous online real time for our students, and they have responded well to that.
Just to jump off that, I think, what Frank is talking about, which I've definitely seen at Marquette too, and I know is happening, is a real attentiveness to how can we also support students more holistically. That career personalis is something, that registers here, but a recognition that this is not a case of, okay, I'm going to take the exact same content, what I would have done, delivering it online asynchronously, and I'm going to have the students do that. That this is a unique time, the unique stressors, and there's need to support students in different ways than we might have previously, particularly in an online format. And so some of this, I think, institutionally is, there's adaptation and expansion of mental health counseling services also. At a place like Marquette too, service learning is a really integral part of the classes, and that they've done a wonderful job there figuring out what can we make that look like in the current context so that students are still being able to fulfill that service part of why they came to Marquette and what they want for their learning as involving that touch point with the community and with the outside world. And so I think that that's sort of a second part of it, is the quality of instruction and the instructional part, and then there's kind of that student support, and they come together in that way.
Yeah, I have I'm sorry, go ahead, Frank.
No, go ahead. I can.
I was just going to say that I have a cousin who's an economics professor out at Montana State, and I was talking with him over the summer, and he was comparing his synchronous courses and his asynchronous courses, and he said that the synchronous courses were not only a better experience for the students, but for him as a teacher.
Yeah. I in the spring when I switched, so I switched mid-semester, we were in person and then we were suddenly switching. And I tried to do some asynchronous components early on, and I wasn't on my game and the students weren't enjoying it. And then by the end of that second half of the semester, we ended up being fully synchronous online, and it was a better experience for me. So I appreciate you saying that, because that tracks, at least with my experience and with many of my colleagues. I think one other thing I would just add, just in terms of the social support piece, or supporting students outside of just the academics in the classroom, is it's probably good, and I think parents can do this as well, to give students a little bit of a nudge to engage in the behavior they otherwise normally would have engaged in if they were with each other in person. So I know, for example, some faculty have forced students into joining study groups where they share their phone number with each other so that they can all get on a group text and start to get to know each other. And normally we wouldn't have to do that, right? Because students would be walking to the same dorm room and they'd be like, hey, we're in that class, like, let me get your number. And like, we could text back and forth. And that's not happening now. And we're finding that particularly for our first year students, they want to do that. And so they just need a little permission. And so on the faculty end, it's been trying to think about deliberate opportunities to kind of engineer or false engineer the kind of social interaction that folks would have, normally on campus. And I think that's important. I think it's hard. It's hard being a first year student, right? Like being on campus, going up to somebody you don't know, saying, hey, do you want to be my friend? Something like that. It's incredibly difficult to do that in an online platform where everybody is just a little thumbnail on the screen. And so trying to encourage that, I think, is really important. There were two other things I wanted to add in this part when we were just talking about colleges and universities, but I guess Ralph and Gabe, I wanted to make sure there wasn't anything else you wanted to jump in on.
I guess there was, and I keep coming back to this based on what you were talking about before about boundaries. Yeah, Gabe was mentioning this, you were mentioning it, the importance of boundaries, both in a physical sense and in terms of study areas and recreational areas. But I think when you're talking about parents encouraging students to reach out and start forming their peer relationships as best as they can under these circumstances, it makes me think about emotional boundaries and sort of cognitive boundaries. And I guess I'm thinking about, in addition to the pandemic and the quarantine, there's so many other things going on right now in our culture in terms of greater awareness of years of injustice, in terms of economic dislocation, the elections coming up. Do you have any thoughts, both of you, on how do young people, how do they keep all this stuff straight in their head? How do they keep the boundaries intact mentally and emotionally, so that they don't just wake up in the morning and feel, oh, there's 15 things that are going wrong as I lay here in bed. Why should I get out of bed? What is it that kids can naturally do and that we can help them do in this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is for all of us. I mean, I have days where I don't want to get out of bed. I mean, that's the state of the world. I think one thing that has been, I remember saying this to my class last spring, a lot of this is just around creating psychological boundaries for ourselves. And so kind of like a buffer zone. I remember telling students to stop necessarily watching and reading and consuming, be it on Facebook or, you know, via television or cable news, just an ongoing stream of bad COVID news, right? Like there had to be some blackout spaces that I think were helpful to students, right? Like don't check the news today, or don't look at your social media feed, or just try to create some boundaries. We are constantly inundated with a stream of information, much of which right now is particularly bleak. There have been other things that I found really helpful to sort of say to students. For example, we had some students in my class that, you know, sort of lost track of their hygiene schedule, for lack of a better word. So they were coming to class, but they weren't showering, or they were in their bed, or right, like they weren't sort of dressed for class, and just trying to maintain all of those boundaries in addition to, like, yes, I have a physical place to study in, but I think the psychological boundaries are helpful. I'm sure Gabe has more to add to this, but you know, trying to kind of separate and pull these things apart and have choice in when you choose to engage with injustice or the state of the world. Now, some of that is a privilege to be able to choose to engage, but I do think being inundated all day, all night with COVID, with racial injustice, with the election, that's hard for people to continue to put themselves through months and months on end, especially when you don't have a lot of other outlets.
Yeah, I think, Frank, that's a great point. You know, that's something that we as adults, like you mentioned, you know, my wife is telling me I need to shut off the news sometimes because I'm getting to that state. But I think, you know, in thinking about these young people, one of the things that I think that came through that was really interesting to me in the survey was how many still feel a sense of social responsibility, and even to a degree a sense of sort of self-efficacy, or that they can contribute to their communities and their neighborhoods. And I think particularly as we think about Regis students or Regis graduates, you know, that's a part of their formation. That's going to be a part of who they are. And so giving them opportunities when all this is going on, when they're feeling like that they don't have control over COVID, they don't have control over the election, right? All these things that are going on, trying to find ways, and again, in the given context, but to support them being active and being engaged or doing something, right? So that could look like, you know, virtual tutoring. That could look like some sort of food pantry. You know, I'm sort of building on the stereotypical kind of service opportunities, but like food pantry, but socially distanced and with masks, or, you know, it might be more creative. But this is a place I think that schools and parents can come together too, to figure out how can we give them opportunities to have an agency and to take action, and even as Frank was saying, to sort of have this control to a certain degree of things that they're able to do during this time.
Well, your insights and your perspectives have been very, very thought-provoking, and your specific advice, I think, is really spot on. I'd like to turn now to some questions that we're getting from our audience. So if you guys are ready, here's a question from a parent. Do you think that there will be increased anxiety regarding safety and health as we start to reopen more, as people think about the fall and the winter?
Gabe, you wanna? I mean,
yeah, I can jump in. I think there will be. I think there will be, but I also know that I think a lot of students and young people, and this is probably for all of us, who have been experiencing a high level anxiety, they may intensify, but they're probably reasons that haven't changed very much. I mean, even though numbers, let's say, have been a little bit lower and they might get higher. I mean, if we ourselves are immunocompromised, or we have family that's immunocompromised, or if you're just really concerned from the beginning, I mean, I think that those levels have probably been so high and will continue very high. One thing I will say to this question, which is kind of an odd little silver lining I found in my study, was asking the young people about changes that they felt would happen in their community and their society in the short and long term. And one of the things that kept coming up was that we are going to be more hygienic, that we're going to be cleaner, that we're going to be healthier as a society. And, you know, often framed in a very positive way, as a sense of like, yeah, I think we're going to be better able to handle this kind of thing in the future, or we're going to see people wearing masks more often and less spread of the flu, or things like that. So I definitely, that doesn't speak to the anxiety part, but I think that speaks to how young people are seeing like this is going to be life-changing, but maybe for the positive in how we think about safety and health as a society.
Yeah, and I do with maybe not just sort of piggyback on what Gabe was saying. I don't know about increased anxiety around health, but certainly an increased attention to health and an increased attention to this, my favorite concept in psychology. I'm being mildly sarcastic, but this notion of self-care and just sort of attentiveness to oneself. And I was reading an article, interestingly, recently, not a journal article, it was a Medium article, but it was talking about this idea of surge capacity, which is sort of body and brain fight and flight systems that we use to kind of adapt during periods of stress. Humans have phenomenal surge capacity, but we usually have surge capacity for traumatic periods that are really like time delimited, right? So a natural disaster that lasts for a couple of days or weeks, a car accident, a traumatic event, an injury, things that sort of end quickly. We can surge up, build our resilience, and sort of navigate our way through it. This is different, right? This is a long-term traumatic event that is now going to stretch probably into its second year, if not beyond that. And so part of what we need to do is not, I would say, not have anxiety around health, but increased attention to health. Like we have to build back the gas in the tank, if you will, or the energy in the store. Like we cannot sustain the level of anxiety and concern that we've had. We can surge up for a little while, but if we don't restore ourselves, we are going to burn out. And the title of the article was something to the effect of, here's why you've been feeling so exhausted, even though all you're doing is, sitting at a computer screen on Zoom all day in your meetings, if you're fortunate enough to do that. So I do think there has to be some concern to like, how do I restore myself?
Frank, that idea of surge capacity really resonates with me. I think that's really critical. And it makes me think another thing about this is a way that families and schools could support young people is helping them reimagine what their future would be like a little bit, or having them talk through that. Now, I think the boundaries we talked about before are important. So it's not, nagging and saying, okay, so now where are you going to go to college? Where are you going to go to college now? How's it going to look? But rather providing them supports to rethink what that might look like. Because this is really weighing on all of us cognitively, but it's also sort of, again, upended the things that we might have been falling into previously when we felt a lot of stress and cognition, because we had this plan, right? And particularly for young people, they had this thought and this plan. And so reframing it, helping them think through and cope in that way, I think could also be a real positive support.
One of the things that we're doing, one of the things we've been doing at Regis for a while is every Thursday for morning prayer, we do the examen. When everybody's in the building, somebody will do it over the public address system. But we've been doing it individually in advisement groups. And in addition to the spiritual benefits, we've been noticing that it also has the potential to give people a space to just sort of put the brakes on for a second and kind of center themselves. So we're starting something else this week that we're calling Mindfulness Monday, where in the morning for the first advisement of the week, we're going to have different mindfulness exercises for students. Have you guys had experiences using those kinds of strategies with individuals that you've been working with?
I have not, but there's like conceptually, there's nothing that you said that doesn't make me excited, right? Like I think that is, just consistent with this idea of kind of finding time to kind of build back our reserves. But I'm curious if Gabe has some more concrete.
Yeah, no, I don't have things that I've done in my professional life, but it does immediately make me think of retreats, right? And that aspect of that when I was at Regis and then I was a Jesuit volunteer later, were foundational for me for figuring out sort of both who I was, particularly in high school, but then also as a Jesuit volunteer in a foreign context, like what I was experiencing, what I was going through. And so I think that mindfulness and that connection that it has already to an element that's really integral to the Regis experience is going to be powerful. And then there's a whole literature in psychology on the powerfulness that mindfulness can have, particularly in times of high stress or high cognitive demand like we're seeing.
Yeah, I'd like to keep talking about this and also get Frank to chime in from an organizational perspective in terms of how organizations are coping with the crisis, but I don't want to neglect questions that are coming in from parents. So I'll try to save time to follow up with you guys on this. But one question that's coming in is, do you guys have any tips for high school freshmen? I imagine there are some similarities in what you've discussed for college freshmen and high school freshmen in terms of some of the social aspects. But what are things that parents that can do to promote social and emotional development when kids haven't even met each other yet, and we don't yet have a chance for casual banter?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think the first part I would say is going back to a little bit what I said before of recognizing that this is going to be different. One of the things that came through in the study was we tend to think sometimes of younger generations, and I think particularly they're talked about in the media discourse as very connected, right? They're always on their phones. They're, chatting with people. They're using TikTok. They're tweeting left and right. They're always connected virtually. And that I think there was some sense maybe that then they would be sort of more resilient in that social part as we sort of all moved remote and online. But that's not the case. And that's not what I was finding. They still need other types of touch points, and they still need support. And that, just kind of leaving them to those virtual means are not always going to be enough. So I think part of it is recognizing that it's going to be challenging for them. And I think part of it is trying to create that in the spaces where we as adults can help smooth things over a little bit. And what I mean by that is, let's say we have a virtual homeroom, or there's a chance for students to get together virtually. That banter, that sort of, that connection across people is not going to necessarily happen naturally. And I think particularly for adolescents, who might be a little bit uncomfortable. And I find this with my students too. When I am the first 5 minutes of class, I have to sort of connect students, bring them together. I'll say, oh, like you in your background look like you're in the same place as them. Are you both in the dorm? Is it the same dorm? And then sort of get them to sort of connect a little bit. And so I think some of our role as adults, particularly, but in the case of it, as educators, is to think about how we can help sort of create those first sort of sparks to get them talking with each other.
Yeah, I would agree with that for sure. I mean, I think it's all, we were saying before, I think I used the word like just giving little nudges, like, oh, you should have this conversation, or why don't you exchange numbers, or just anything that kind of forces that. It might feel artificial, but it won't be. In a couple weeks, it'll take off from there.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that we've, as you know, we have a long tradition of service at Regis, and that can also, in addition to fulfilling our mission, it also provides points of connection. Do either of you have any ideas on how people can do service in the community during this time when we're supposed to be isolating ourselves?
Gabe, you talked about service at Marquette. I mean, we're still, same thing. Loyola as an institution is dedicated to community service. And I think, some of what we do, we have a clinical center that provides therapy and other services to the community. So some of those services have just gone remote. And we've also had students be able to engage in, little psychoeducational groups with members in the community that are now taking place via Zoom. Like I thought Gabe had this suggestion before about, online tutoring that I think was a great suggestion. And some of this is, how shall I say, some of this is also dependent on people's risk tolerance, which is a huge individual difference variable. But if you are comfortable, for example, I know in Baltimore you are able to serve, some nonprofits have sort of outside food distribution, or soup kitchens, and so if you feel comfortable putting a mask on and being outdoors and serving the community that way, that's an option. But I think those start to get into the individual choice category, where risk tolerance I think is widely variable. But Gabe, I'm sure you have other things to add.
Yeah, so I think the service learning program, as I mentioned, Marquette has done a really wonderful job, and some of it is what I talked about before that Frank mentioned, sort of the virtual tutoring, and they have a whole number of options. And one of the things I appreciate is they offer students this range so that those who want to be in person in socially distanced contexts where they can do something, they have that option. And those who don't feel comfortable with that, or maybe aren't even on campus, have options as well. Some other things that come to my mind too, that are happening, I know at Marquette. One is fundraising, that money is going to support causes that may need it right now. And so something that came up in the spring was, homemaking masks in certain ways. I don't know how they even go about doing that, because I can't even begin to make anything with my hands, but they were making masks and then they were selling them, fundraising, and then using that money to support a cause that was very timely. I think another thing that could possibly come up is around the election. Now, I mean, there are many ways, I think, without being partisan, that you can be involved and make an impact. And one of those is, for instance, there are organizations out there, again, nonpartisan, that you can just write letters to voters that encourage them to vote, or voter registration drives. And so I think those are all sort of opportunities that could be sort of, that exist, and both allow them to engage with some of what's going on, right? So you can register voters, and the election's going on, it's overwhelming, but you're doing something to support our democracy. So those are a couple ideas.
Yeah, and at my old parish elementary school in the spring, now that school had been staffed for decades by the Sisters of St. Joseph. So in the springtime, the 8th graders, as a service project, they wrote to various sisters at the retirement home on Long Island, just to say, hey, we don't know you, but we know what your group has done for our school. We just wanted to let you know we're thinking of you. And that was something that was very much appreciated by the elderly nuns. I have another question, more specific, related to college teaching and learning. What are you guys thinking about classes where some students are on site and some students are online? I know, Frank, you alluded to this earlier in terms of models.
Yeah.
What's your thinking on that?
I think that, if the institution has the technology in place, particularly in the classroom, to accommodate the students who are virtual, it can be done pretty effectively and pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
So I will say right now, we have some graduate classes happening in the department in person. But even if most higher ed institutions open fully in person in the spring, because of pre-existing health conditions, there will always be a number of students that are online until this virus is more tame. And so even if we go to a fully face-to-face model, everyone's going to have to contend with this kind of hybrid model that the question is asking. As long as the rooms are technologically set up for having a Zoom interface, a camera, the ability for students to sort of talk and engage with each other, people who are at home being able to talk and hear people who are in the classroom, and vice versa. They can see the same PowerPoint presentations, they can hear the instructor. As long as the technology is in place, that can be done effectively. And I know we're doing that right now at Loyola, and we're doing it effectively, and it's mixed, right? We have some classes where we have 2/3 of the class in person and maybe just a handful of students online, and that is going well. And then we have the reverse, where we have a handful of students in the classroom and the bulk of them online, and that is also going well. But it's contingent on the institution having the technology. One of the things we haven't said yet, a point that I wanted to make, is there's been a lot of bad press around higher education, all the schools that are not succeeding, all the students that are getting sick. The New York Times is tracking, coronavirus cases at colleges and universities across the country. There are some institutions that are doing well, and that have really put the money and the resources into the kind of technology that's required to deliver instruction effectively. It's expensive, right? I mean, we have spent, let's just say, multiple millions of dollars here at Loyola to outfit the campus for an in-person return and for this kind of instruction. And I think Gabe alluded to that cost before, but I think if the institution is doing it, and most institutions I'm aware of are committed to this because that's our business, we have to do it well, I do think you can be effective with a hybrid of in-person and online students in the same class.
I have an interesting question from a parent whose second Regine is a freshman, and they're noting that they're having trouble getting him to open up as to what's going on, but they do notice that he insists on doing all his classes and homework in the dining room instead of in his bedroom, and that they also so they're concerned that might be a boundary issue, but they're also noting that generally one of the effective ways they've communicated with their children in the past is not sitting down and having a face-to-face, heart-to-heart, but having kind of a sideways conversation while they're in the car, they're going to the subway, or they're just together and not making a formal sit-down conversation. And they're looking for some suggestions about how to get kids to open up when you don't have as many of these casual opportunities where you can kind of ease into conversations with your kid in a way that would seem more natural. Before you guys speak, I do have one thought on this.
I was going to say, Ralph, you're the clinical psychologist among the group, so you should take this question.
All right. Well, let me take this question a little bit, but you guys will feel free to chime in. I guess one question I would have about the student wanting to do his work in the dining room. It's again, I don't have enough information to offer an opinion as to whether this is a boundary issue, but I would also suggest the possibility it could be your son's method of trying to impose some structure on himself, that he wants to be doing his work out in public because he knows, I'm presuming if you're like every other Regis parent, you'll notice if he's, his attention has wandered and he's not following up. So I might wonder if that's actually a positive sign that he's trying to create some structure. Now, if it's inconvenient for everybody else, then maybe one of the things that would work is to see if you can find some other ways to provide him structure that's not taking up the dining room and expanding into other common areas of the house. In terms of the riding in the car question, I think sometimes if you can have a conversation with the kid where you're talking about him, but you're not really talking about him, that you're talking about a cousin, or Uncle Billy called and he was telling me about this, that use the old a friend of mine gambit that kids often use when they want to bring up something about themselves that's uncomfortable. That can actually work two ways. So those would be my two quick suggestions for that.
Yeah, I might just chime into that to say too, thinking about whether they be traditions or not, but things that you can do with your child that may be new or may be different. It may require you changing your schedule or sacrificing a little bit, that you can just be spending time talking together, right? Because part of what's there in the car is just that sort of forced time together. And now, there might be the opportunity to, maybe you're not into horror movies, but your child does like them a lot. So maybe you have a Friday night horror movie, like watching together, or something around cooking, or, something that you create now into this rhythm. Because there is a sense too, I think, of an opportunity. And, some of the kids in the survey are saying this, where, I'm spending more time with my family, or I have the opportunity to learn a new hobby or activity. And so that could be something that you sort of do together. Really drawing on their interests and maybe their schedule too. You might have to stay up later or get up earlier, or whatever it be. But then it creates those opportunities for conversation to happen sort of naturally and organically.
Yeah, and I would just say I had a similar reaction to doing work, at the dining room table, right, or in the sort of shared common space. I as Ralph did, I think it actually might be a good thing, in addition to the accountability, but it actually might be an invitation for a conversation, right? To sort of put that, front and center in the family space. And so maybe it won't be as difficult as you think.
Okay, I'm getting the signal that it's time for one more question, but I'm going to cheat and I'm going to lump two questions together. So.
Okay.
One parent says, while trying to encourage our children the best we can to engage in safe activities, it was done with the hope that this would soon be over. Now that that's less certain, how do we keep our kids on the right path when others are not doing the same thing, such as following social distancing rules? And then I want to add to that a question from another parent. How do you address the mentality of young kids when they feel that they'll be fine if they get COVID? So that's a twofer. That's a twofer for you guys.
I think that those are both important questions. And, it makes me think in my mind too of one of the struggles I've heard from administrators at Marquette is sort of, you have some students who want to sort of have a normal social life, and they might want to party, they might want to interact. They're not concerned about the COVID, about getting COVID and its spread. And then you have students who, are sort of either really concerned, or they're trying to sort of figure out how they maybe can influence their peers and convince them not to. I part of me wants to say, the rational argument, to sort of hit them with the evidence, because I think that is important to get across. The fact that it does spread amongst young people. There was a study that came out today out of India that was an incredibly large study with contact tracing that, again, I think emphasizes the idea that you may not get it intensely, but you're going to spread it. And then the other thing is sort of that's like a larger sort of idea of evidence. And then there's the stories, the individual stories. There was one that I saw today of a young 19-year-old at I forget which university, but he was an athlete, and he passed away from neurological complications from COVID-19, right? And very quickly from being diagnosed. And so there's that sort of evidence part, but I think, sometimes that we all don't necessarily listen to that, and psychologically the reasons we don't too. But there's also the part of the sense of community and your responsibility, and maybe tapping into that to say, you might not, but like, this is how it spreads, this is how it continues. You're going to have friends, peers who are immunocompromised themselves, or live with people who are more at risk, right? And those are the people that will end up, really suffering if they get it. And by you doing this, you are contributing to the possibility to a higher risk for them.
And I just want to add, and it's rare that a question comes in that is so on point, and I know that this will probably be the sort of last piece, so I'll try to go quickly. But I received an actual research article from a colleague of mine recently who's a social psychologist, and I'm a social organizational psychologist. We were talking about what we know from social psychology about how to get people to engage in safe behaviors. And so there's just a couple of things that stood out to me. There were a list of 10 things, and maybe I'll pass this along to be shared out as a resource. Using clear, consistent, and transparent messaging, I think, is important, but avoiding undue attention to the frequency of socially undesirable behaviors, right? So not drawing too much attention to the people who are not following social distancing or not doing the right thing, and instead focusing more on the people who do. I think that social norming approach is really helpful, fostering kind of a sense of self-efficacy that you can control this, and avoiding this sort of sense of fatalism. And, I think has been said, like appealing to the collective good of one's community. There is a growing sense that I think we have lost as a country, that we are all in this together. And I hope, if nothing else comes from COVID, it's this idea that we really all are interconnected and related to each other in serious ways.
Yeah, and I think what both of you are saying also serves the goals that you were talking about earlier, which is to foster a sense of efficacy and the ability to cope with things. In that you're laying out the pros and cons, and saying to your teenager or your collegian, we have an expectation that you'll figure this out, having accurate information. And that it becomes, both of your approaches are talking about not focusing it on this is what you must do, like not letting the kids regress back into the, oh no, I'm stuck home and now you're telling me what to do again like I'm 11, that it avoids that risk.
And there was a study that I did see over the summer talking about college kids and how to get them to adhere to healthy behaviors. And the take-home message was that the students didn't want punishment. They didn't want anything punitive. What they wanted was empathy, right? Like they wanted to know, like, we get how hard this is. We hear you. We understand. We know you're struggling. You can do this. So it's sort of empathy and that piece of self-efficacy, and less on the punitive piece.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful in general right now, is a sense of recognizing the difficulty of all these things for young people, of what they're experiencing, what they're thinking to their futures, and even this, the social distancing, what we're asking of them to keep everyone safe. I think it's important first step is just recognize that with them.
Yeah, and I think that as you're saying, that's true for all of us, not just for the kids. It's been a struggle for everybody. And so one of the things that and actually I think this is no accident, but in a lot of our community prayer this fall, we've been using a prayer by Teilhard, where it's a prayer for patience, for not rushing. We're not rushing our closeness to God, but letting it unfold in God's own time. And I think that's something that we can apply in this situation also, the kind of benefit of the doubt approach, that when we talk to our kids, if they have the facts, and if they've been raised the way we raised them, that they will find their way to an empathic response and figure out what the right thing is to do and do it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'd like to thank you again, both Frank and Gabe, for your time and for this wonderful conversation. I feel like we could go on for another 3 hours. I'd like to remind parents who have tuned in that we're grateful for you joining us tonight, and that we will be sending a follow-up email that has additional resources that you might find helpful, and we'll also have a link to a recording of this conversation tonight, and we'd ask that you pass that around to anybody who was unable to join us tonight. But thanks to everyone for coming. Thanks to our presenters. Thanks to the Development Office for sponsoring this for us. And thanks to Father Lehart for coming. And thanks to everybody. And I hope that we can all stay safe and well throughout the school year. So God bless us. Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Thank you, Ralph. Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.